Former President Trump's impeachment trial begins tomorrow. What's at stake here, and what are Trump's lawyers planning for his defense? A new report found of the 22 cases that have been heard by the courts and decided on their merits, Trump and Republicans have prevailed in 15. This means Trump has won 2/3 of the cases fully adjudicated by the courts. And if former President Trump started his own social media platform, would you join? One advisor says that might be an option. Tune into Deep Dive as we explore these topics and more. Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meyer. Former President Trump's impeachment trial begins tomorrow. What's at stake here, and what are Trump's lawyers planning for his defense? Republican Senator Rand Paul says the impeachment trial is doomed to fail. He says the impeachment amounts to criminalizing speech. And in that case, a number of Democrats should face trial too. Speaking to Fox News on Sunday, Paul said, "I mean, really, we ought to impeach Chuck Schumer then." That's a reference to Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing in 2018, when a group tried to invade the building. Schumer allegedly stood outside saying, "Hey, Kavanaugh, you've unleashed a whirlwind, and you're going to pay the price." Paul went on to say this inflammatory wording, this violent rhetoric of Chuck Schumer was so bad that the Chief Justice, who rarely says anything publicly, immediately said this kind of language is dangerous as a mob tried to invade the Supreme Court. Paul has previously warned about pursuing the Senate trial. He argues it's unconstitutional since Trump no longer holds office, adding the former president's comments to supporters on January 6th are protected under the First Amendment. Paul said in the interview, "People are going to have to judge for themselves. Are we going to potentially prosecute people for political speech?" And a constitutional law professor says it's unheard of to expect a president or former president to testify in his impeachment trial. Professor Jonathan Turley, writing for Fox News, says holding Trump's refusal to testify against him is even worse. He wrote, "It contradicts not just our principles, but centuries of legal writing." Last week, the House impeachment manager, Representative Jamie Raskin, wrote to former President Trump and his lawyers, suggesting Trump should testify under oath this week during the Senate trial. The Democrats said that if Trump doesn't show up to testify, it could be used against him. The Senate requires at least 67 votes to convict a president during an impeachment trial, while the House only needs a simple majority. Meanwhile, any GOP senator who joins Democrats in voting to convict will likely face intense blowback from their constituents and local Republican Party chapters. The House impeachment brief alleges that Trump incited a mob to breach the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Trump's legal team denies the allegation and has two main points of argument. One, that the trial is unconstitutional because Trump is no longer president. And secondly, that Trump exercised his First Amendment right. That includes freedom of speech. Trump's lawyers say the trial is an attack on free speech and that if Trump's guilty of violent rhetoric, then some Democrats are too. So how is Trump's defense shaping up? One of Trump's lead impeachment defense attorneys says he will use video clips during the trial of top Democrats allegedly inciting violence. As an example, attorney Bruce Castor noted Democrats' response to riots last summer involving arson, looting, and attacks on law enforcement officers. He told Fox's Laura Ingraham some Democrats nationwide cheered when the rioters were burning down the cities and attacked the federal law enforcement officers last summer in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. He said, "But here, when you have the President of the United States give a speech and says you should peacefully make your thinking known to the people in Congress, he's all of a sudden the villain." During his January 6th speech, which later became the focus of the Democrats' impeachment against him, Trump told his supporters, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." January 6th has been in the news a lot recently, and one former police sergeant calls it extremely frustrating. Retired Sergeant Betsy Smith told NTD's The Nation Speaks, "We are focusing on one riot on January 6th, and it's extremely frustrating to law enforcement." She went on to say right now their current obsession is, white supremacy, white supremacists, and the Capitol riot. They don't want to talk about the other 99% of violent riots that American law enforcement has been dealing with for the past almost year. Smith now represents the National Police Association. She's a 29-year veteran in law enforcement. Smith's concerns come as protesters, including Black Lives Matter and far-left activists, continue to clash with police in cities across the nation. Some are alleged to be members of the anarcho-communist group Antifa, who infiltrated a number of peaceful protests calling for police reform and created scenes of civil unrest, including violent acts, lighting fires, looting, and damaging property. Speaking of unrest, Black Lives Matter protesters and Antifa agitators marched through Washington on February 6th and threatened people as they ate dinner. That's according to video footage and reports. They chanted, "Burn it down," and "We are here tonight because Black Lives Matter." Independent journalist Andy Ngo told the Epoch Times last week the idea that Antifa is merely an ideology is false. He says the group is more than an idea, it's also a movement. Some have noted that the continuation of Black Lives Matter protests and Antifa riots is a signal that there's a growing schism within the American left. Since Biden's inauguration, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and other cities have occasionally seen violent demonstrations. Speaking of the election, a new report found Trump won 2/3 of the cases fully adjudicated by the courts. That's according to citizen journalist John Droz Jr., a physicist and environmental advocate in Morehead City, North Carolina. He said of the 22 cases that have been heard by the courts and decided on their merits, Trump and the Republicans have prevailed in 15. Droz and a team dug through court filings and legal minutiae to track down 81 lawsuits that were filed in connection with the 2020 election. He says of the 81 cases, 11 were withdrawn or consolidated, and 23 were dismissed. Droz says those should not be considered wins or losses for either side, as they have nothing to do with the merits of the case. This leaves 47 cases. Of those, 22 have been finalized after the court heard arguments, considered evidence, and then issued a ruling. According to the analysis of those 22, Trump or the Republicans won 15 and lost 7. This leaves 25 lawsuits that have yet to be finalized. Droz said in a statement, "This means Trump and the Republicans have won the majority of 2020 election cases fully heard and then decided on the merits." He noted that's the opposite of most media reports. Droz explains the reasoning behind his report, saying, "Our view is that the public needs to be much better educated regarding the election integrity issue, and having a more accurate understanding of the lawsuit components is a key part of that." And on that note, the U.S. Supreme Court scheduled several high-profile election lawsuits for consideration next week. The court will decide if they will hear the cases later this year. Some of the well-known election lawsuits from the 2020 presidential election are on their way to the Supreme Court. Among them are lawsuits brought by the Trump campaign and attorneys Sidney Powell and Lin Wood. Trump supporters had hoped the lawsuits would swing the election in his favor. Trump advisor Peter Navarro reported that various forms of election irregularities were significant enough to change election results. But the U.S. Supreme Court refused to fact-check the cases ahead of the January 20th presidential inauguration. It also rejected a lawsuit filed by the Attorney General of Texas that sought to disqualify the results of several battleground states. Advocates say the lawsuits are needed to help ensure election integrity in the future. Trump's attorney John Eastman told the Washington Examiner that it is still important for courts to review their case. If the Supreme Court decides to take any of the cases, they likely won't be heard until October. And there's growing pushback against big tech. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is working on a bill to prevent big tech companies moderating user content based on political viewpoint. Texas State Senator Brian Hughes is also working on the bill. He told WFAA it'll address unbalanced moderation of social media accounts, adding it'll give users a way to get back online if they're removed by tech companies like Facebook and Twitter, and that federal law allows the state to regulate this. His announcement follows Florida's new legislation penalizing social media companies that deplatform candidates during an election. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said at a press conference last week that social media companies started out as neutral platforms that offered an avenue of free speech, but have now become narrative enforcers. He said they now manipulate news and influence election outcomes. Florida will require companies who promote a candidate to record these endorsements as political campaign contributions. Several states are taking steps to protect the free flow of speech and prevent Silicon Valley companies from using their monopoly to police ideas they don't agree with politically. Critics say much of the company's moderation in the past year has focused on conservative speech and comments from people deemed supporters of former President Trump. With Trump removed from almost all social media platforms, many are wondering, will Trump launch his own social media? His senior advisor, Jason Miller, told Breitbart all options are on the table. Miller said whether that's joining an existing platform or creating his new platform, there are a number of different options. So stay tuned there because you know he's going to be back on social media. Many platforms suspended or banned Trump's account following the violence at the Capitol. And then last week, a flurry of reports whether Trump joined Gab, after this letter was posted using Trump's old Twitter handle. But Gab CEO Andrew Torba disputed the news, saying Trump hasn't signed up for the website, adding he set up the account in 2016 in anticipation of Trump one day getting banned. Big tech companies justified banning Trump as an effort to guard against violence, claiming that Trump had violated their terms of use. But what do you think? If Trump launched his own platform, would you join? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meyer, and see you soon.